In the heart of the city, where glass towers touched the clouds and car horns became a kind of urban melody, there sat a man who most people no longer noticed. He lived by the fountain in the corner of Brookfield Square, his world reduced to a few tattered belongings, a blanket that had long lost its color, and a collection of old paintbrushes he guarded like treasure. His name was Eli Turner, though few remembered it. Every morning, as the city woke, Eli would sit on the edge of the fountain, spreading his paints on an old cardboard pallet. He never begged, never asked for help. Instead, he painted faces of strangers passing by, people too busy to look at him, people lost in their phones, their thoughts, their lives. Sometimes they stopped, curious about the man who painted in silence. Most didn't. Eli's hands were rough, but his strokes were precise, elegant even. Each canvas, often just pieces of cardboard or discarded posters, told a story of someone else's life. He had painted laughter, heartbreak, hope, and despair. His art captured what people didn't say out loud, what hid behind their polished smiles. But no one knew why he painted. No one asked. Years ago, Eli had been someone else, someone with a family, a small apartment, a future. He once taught art at a local community center. But life, in its unpredictable cruelty, had stripped that away piece by piece. A fire. A loss. A series of bad decisions. Before he knew it, the man who once painted joy for children was left painting strangers on the street. Still, there was something noble about him, an invisible thread of pride that refused to snap. Eli never complained. He just painted, as if trying to prove that beauty could still exist, even in the ruins of a forgotten life. One cold morning, as the city was still waking up, Eli found a new canvas, a wooden board left behind by a construction crew. He brushed off the dust and smiled faintly. That day, he decided he would paint something different. Not just another passing face. Something that mattered. Something that might make the world stop for a moment and see him. He began to paint from memory, the skyline of the city, the way sunlight reflected on skyscraper windows, and a single figure standing at the top, overlooking it all. He didn't know who the man was. Perhaps a dream, perhaps someone he used to be. Hours turned into days. The painting grew. And so did the whispers. Passers-by began to slow down, curious about the homeless man whose artwork looked like it belonged in a gallery. Some took pictures. Others left coins, not for charity, but for respect. By the end of the week, the board was nearly complete. The colors danced under the daylight, sharp blues, deep golds, and a haunting figure staring out from the skyline. It was raw, powerful, alive. Eli stood back and smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he felt proud. Not just of the painting, but of himself. That evening, as the fountain lights flickered and people hurried home, a black car stopped nearby. The kind of car that didn't belong in that part of town. The door opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out. He watched Eli silently for a long time before walking closer. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the painting, and then at Eli. Eli felt something stir inside him. Recognition? No. Something deeper. The man's eyes carried weight, the kind of gaze that had seen success, money, and power. But also loneliness. The stranger left after a few minutes, disappearing into the city's glow. Eli didn't know who he was, but something told him their paths were not done crossing. That night, the fountain shimmered beneath the streetlights, and Eli sat beside his masterpiece, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Somewhere across town, in a penthouse overlooking the same skyline Eli had just painted, the billionaire James Whitmore stared out his window. His reflection merged with the city lights, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a tycoon. He saw a man who had lost himself chasing success. The image of the homeless painter haunted him. And the next morning, he decided to go back. Morning sunlight spilled across the city, painting golden streaks on glass and concrete. The day had only just begun, yet there was a strange stillness in the air around Brookfield Square. The fountain murmured softly as people hurried past, all except for one man who had returned to find the artist he couldn't stop thinking about. James Whitmore stood across the street, hidden behind the tinted window of his car. He watched Eli Turner unpack his paints, his movements slow but precise, each gesture deliberate, as though he was performing a sacred ritual. James had seen hundreds of artists before, in galleries, auctions, and luxury showings, but none of them had ever stirred him like this man did. There was something in Eli's silence, in the way he painted without expectation, that felt unsettlingly pure. James had built an empire through precision, deals, and dominance. Yet looking at this man, who had nothing but color and hope, he realized how empty his own success had become. Eventually, he stepped out of the car. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he crossed the square. People moved aside instinctively, not because they recognized him, but because of the quiet authority he carried. He stopped a few feet from Eli. The artist didn't look up. His brush was dancing across a new piece of cardboard, pulling life from discarded scraps. It wasn't until the shadow fell across his work that Eli finally glanced upward. Their eyes met again, one lined with exhaustion and years of struggle, the other with the calm weariness of power. James said nothing. He didn't need to. His gaze dropped to the painting from the day before, the one of the city skyline and the solitary figure above it. He knelt, studying the strokes, the depth of light and shadow. He saw emotion there, ambition and regret interwoven. It felt uncomfortably familiar. Eli didn't know who this man was, but he sensed something different in him. Not pity, not curiosity, but understanding. A kind of recognition that goes beyond words. James reached into his pocket and drew out a sleek business card, placing it quietly beside Eli's paint box. Then, after one more look at the painting, he turned and walked away. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, yet it felt like a bridge had been built, between two worlds that rarely touched. When Eli picked up the card, his hands trembled slightly. The name was embossed in silver letters, James Whitmore, Whitmore Holdings. The name rang a bell. Not from television or newspapers, but from his past. Years ago, Eli had painted murals for a new corporate building in the city. He had met the owner briefly then, a man with ambition shining in his eyes and a drive that could move mountains. Could this be the same man? The memory stirred something deep in him. That was before the fire. Before his life unraveled. Before everything changed. As he studied the card, he noticed something else, a faint fingerprint of paint left on the edge. His own. The mark of a forgotten artist on the life of a billionaire. Later that afternoon, while the city pulsed with routine, James sat in his office overlooking the skyline. The painting lingered in his mind. His assistant handed him reports, contracts, proposals, none of which he truly saw. Instead, he thought of the man by the fountain, his weathered hands and the quiet dignity with which he painted the world that ignored him. James had spent his entire life climbing, every decision a step higher, every success another wall built between him and the world. But lately, it had all begun to feel meaningless. The mansion, the cars, the private dinners, they echoed with silence. He couldn't explain why, but he wanted to see Eli again. Not to buy his painting, not to help him, but to understand him. The next morning, he returned to Brookfield Square, carrying something unusual for a man of his stature, a large empty canvas. Eli was there, as always, surrounded by the faint scent of wet paint and cold air. When he saw the man approach again, his heart sank a little. He didn't want charity. He didn't want pity disguised as generosity. But James didn't offer money. Instead, he placed the blank canvas beside Eli and stepped back. No words. No explanations. It was an invitation, an unspoken request. Eli stared at the canvas, his breath catching slightly. No one had given him one in years. He had been painting on garbage for so long that the idea of real, stretched canvas felt unreal, sacred, even. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a silent challenge. Over the next few days, James visited often. He would stand nearby, watching Eli paint, his expression unreadable. People began to notice, a billionaire standing beside a homeless man, day after day, as though they were equals. The rumors spread. Some called it charity. Others said it was an art project. But neither of them cared. What grew between them wasn't friendship in the ordinary sense, it was connection. A quiet, wordless understanding that both had fallen in different ways. By the end of the week, the new painting was nearly finished. It wasn't a city this time, or a stranger's face. It was a portrait, raw, emotional, haunting. A man staring at his own reflection, one half dressed in rags, the other in a tailored suit. Both have shared the same eyes. When James saw it, he froze. He understood immediately. The man in the painting wasn't just him. It was them both. The billionaire and the homeless artist, Two lives separated by circumstance, but united by the same quiet longing for meaning. That night, James took the painting home. But he couldn't sleep. The eyes from the portrait followed him, accusing, understanding, forgiving all at once. Something inside him shifted. He began looking through his old archives, searching for the murals from years ago. The community art project that had decorated his first building. When he finally found the records, one signature caught his eye. E. Turner. The realization hit like a blow. The homeless man wasn't just an artist. He was the artist who had once helped launch his company's image. The man whose work had inspired him at the very beginning. And now, he was living by a fountain, forgotten by the same world that once admired his art. James sat in silence until dawn, staring at the painting. He knew what he had to do next. The city was still asleep when James Whitmore left his penthouse the next morning. For the first time in years, he didn't wear a suit. He walked alone, no driver, no assistant, no polished exterior to shield him. Only a quiet purpose guided his steps, a decision made in the sleepless hours between night and dawn. The air was crisp as he reached Brookfield Square. The fountain gurgled softly, a lonely rhythm echoing through the near-empty plaza. Eli Turner was there, as always, wrapped in his worn coat, setting out his paints like a ritual he'd never abandoned. His movements were calm, almost graceful, as if he painted to keep the world from falling apart. James stood at a distance for a while, watching him. He thought about all the lives that passed by this man every day, how they looked but never saw. How many like him had once dreamed big, only to be erased by circumstance. He didn't want to offer money. Money was too easy, too hollow. He wanted to give him something that meant more, a second chance without pity. James spent that morning making calls, quietly arranging something behind closed doors. His name opened doors, and for once, he used that influence for something selfless. By afternoon, the empty art gallery on 5th Street, one his company owned but had left unused, had been cleaned, lit, and prepared. The bare white walls now waited for color. That evening, he returned to the fountain. Eli was still there, finishing a painting of a child chasing a balloon through a storm. The detail was mesmerizing, the tension between innocence and chaos perfectly balanced. When James approached, Eli gave a faint nod of recognition, his eyes curious but cautious. James set a folded paper down on the fountain's edge. A lease agreement. 3 months, fully covered. No conditions, no names, just the keys to an empty gallery space downtown. On top of it lay a small envelope, not with cash, but with a note that simply read, "Let the city see what it's been missing." Eli froze. He didn't look at James, didn't speak, but something flickered across his face. Confusion, disbelief, then an emotion he hadn't felt in years, hope. James didn't wait for thanks. He simply nodded once and walked away. For hours, Eli sat by the fountain, staring at the paper. The idea of walking into a gallery again felt impossible. He had painted on scraps for so long that he'd forgotten what walls and frames felt like. But the thought wouldn't leave him. Maybe this was a sign, a final chance to redeem all the years that had vanished. That night, he didn't sleep. He gathered his paintings, his brushes, and even the broken boards he'd painted on. One by one, he stacked them carefully, wrapping them with old newspapers as though they were fragile children. When dawn came, he walked through the city with them strapped to an old cart, every step echoing with nervous anticipation. 5th Street was quiet when he arrived. The gallery stood in silence, its glass doors gleaming in the morning sun. He hesitated at the entrance, staring at his reflection, the rough beard, the tired eyes, the clothes that told of hardship. For a moment, he almost turned back. But then he remembered something his father used to say, "The world only sees what you choose to show it." And Eli Turner had chosen to show the world his truth. Inside, the gallery smelled of fresh paint and polished floors. Empty walls surrounded him, waiting like a blank page. He began unpacking his pieces, lining them along the wall, one after another, each one a story of survival, loneliness, beauty, and brokenness. By noon, the gallery was alive. Paintings filled every corner, portraits of strangers, cityscapes twisted by emotion, moments of light in dark places. Each piece told not only his story but the story of everyone who had ever walked past him without knowing. He worked for 3 days straight, sleeping only in short bursts. People began to notice. A photographer from a local art blog spotted him through the window and took pictures. A passerby shared a post online with the caption, "The homeless artist who turned a gallery into a miracle." Within hours, the story spread. By the fourth evening, the once empty space was filled with visitors. They came out of curiosity, but stayed in awe. They saw talent where the world had seen only poverty. Some cried quietly as they stared at the paintings, recognizing emotions they had long buried. Others whispered to one another, wondering how someone who lived with nothing could create something so full of life. Eli didn't stand among them. He stayed near the back, hidden in the shadow of a column, watching the crowd move through his world. For the first time, he felt something like peace, not pride, but validation. The world was seeing him again, not as a beggar, but as an artist. Meanwhile, James stood outside the gallery, away from the cameras and noise. He didn't go in. He didn't want credit or recognition. Watching was enough. He saw Eli's expression, quiet disbelief melting into gratitude, and he knew he had done the right thing. But James also knew this wasn't the end. The attention would come fast, and with it, temptation. He needed to make sure Eli's gift wasn't taken from him again, not by greed, not by exploitation. Over the next few days, James made more discreet arrangements. A silent investor here, a trustworthy curator there. Every step ensured Eli would remain free, the art would belong to him, the earnings under his name. Soon, offers began to flood in. Newspapers wanted interviews. Collectors wanted exclusives. But Eli refused them all at first. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to trust. It scared him more than the loneliness ever had. Still, one evening, as the gallery lights dimmed and the last visitor left, he stood before the painting of the man in the suit and the man in rags, the one he had painted for James. The reflection in that painting seemed to look back at him with approval. Maybe it was time to step forward. That night, he locked the gallery and walked through the city, not as the man by the fountain, but as an artist reborn. He didn't know where this new path would lead. But he knew this much: his life, once forgotten by the city, had begun to echo again in its heartbeat. And somewhere in a quiet office high above the skyline, James watched the news reports with a faint, tired smile. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man chasing success. He felt human again. But as with all rebirths, shadows from the past have a way of following. A face from Eli's old life, someone who once helped destroy it, had just seen the headlines. And they were coming back. The weeks that followed were a blur of color and attention. Eli Turner's name began appearing in places he never imagined it could: newspaper headlines, art columns, social media posts shared by strangers who once walked past him without a glance. His gallery had become a quiet phenomenon, a living story of redemption in the heart of the city. Every day, new faces filled the room. Reporters came with notebooks and recorders. Students came with curiosity. Wealthy collectors came with offers that made Eli's head spin. Yet through it all, he remained calm, grounded in something deeper than fame: gratitude. He no longer slept by the fountain. A modest apartment above the gallery became his home. Small, but clean. The kind of place that smelled of old wood and turpentine. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the window, catching flecks of paint floating in the air. For the first time in years, he had a bed, a key, and a reason to wake up. But peace, as always, never stays untouched for long. One rainy afternoon, as the gallery emptied and thunder rolled outside, Eli noticed a figure standing at the door. The man didn't move for a long time, just watched. Then, as if the moment had chosen itself, he stepped inside. He was older now, heavier, but the arrogance in his posture hadn't changed. His eyes scanned the walls, lingering on the paintings with something between amusement and jealousy. Eli recognized him instantly. Victor Hale. Years ago, Victor had been Eli's business partner, the co-founder of a small art studio that once promised to bring local artists into the spotlight. Together, they had built dreams, painted walls, and taught others to believe in beauty. But when the studio began to grow, Victor saw opportunity where Eli saw loyalty. The fire that destroyed their studio hadn't been an accident. Eli had never proven it, but deep inside he knew. The night of the fire, Victor had taken everything: the savings, the client list, even Eli's wife's paintings, and disappeared. That betrayal had started Eli's descent into ruin. And now, years later, the man who had left him in the ashes stood in his gallery, admiring his comeback with a smirk that felt like poison. Victor spoke, but Eli didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. For the next few days, Victor lingered in the edges of Eli's world. He visited the gallery often, pretending to be a friend, a supporter. Others assumed he was part of Eli's past life, an old associate, maybe even a manager. Eli didn't correct them. He didn't want confrontation, not after finally finding peace. But trouble moves quietly before it strikes. Soon, whispers began to circle. Rumors that Eli wasn't the true artist behind some of his pieces. That a partner had helped him. That the homeless painter's miracle was a publicity stunt. The more people talked, the more doubt spread. Victor knew how to manipulate perception. He had done it before, and he was doing it again. He began contacting gallery owners, journalists, and sponsors, claiming partial ownership of Eli's early works. He twisted memories into claims, turning admiration into suspicion. Some believed him. Others hesitated. Eli tried to ignore it, but the damage was seeping through the cracks. One morning, he arrived at the gallery to find a letter slipped under the door, a legal notice. Victor had filed a claim of intellectual property, demanding rights to Eli's earlier murals and shared profits from the gallery's exhibits. The words blurred as Eli read them. He hadn't cried in years, but the weight of it all pressed hard against his chest. After everything he had rebuilt, after clawing his way back from invisibility, his past was clawing back. James Whitmore found out the same afternoon. He had kept his distance since the gallery's success, content to watch from afar. But when the news reached him, he felt something sharp twist inside. He owed Eli more than a silent watch. That evening, he went to see him. Eli sat in his small apartment, surrounded by unfinished canvases. He looked older, smaller, the light in his eyes dimmed by exhaustion. James didn't speak. He simply sat across from him, the quiet of understanding between them. Then, after a long silence, he opened a folder, one filled with documents, background checks, and legal proofs. He had been investigating Victor since the day he reappeared. In his world, truth was a weapon. And this time, he would use it for good. Over the following days, James's team began collecting evidence, old contracts, witness statements, photographs of the original studio. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth emerged. Victor's lies unraveled. The fire, the stolen funds, the forged papers, all of it. But Eli wasn't just facing legal threats. He was facing ghosts, the emotional ruins left behind. Memories of betrayal, of loss, of the night when everything he loved turned to smoke. The smell of burning would haunted him still. He began painting again, not for fame, not for exhibitions, but as a shield against despair. His strokes turned darker, heavier. Each piece bled anger, grief, and fear. The gallery walls became a mirror of his inner storm. When the city saw those paintings, they didn't just see art. They saw truth. They saw pain turned into color. People began to realize the difference between imitation and authenticity. They saw the soul that only the real artist could pour into a brushstroke. Victor's lies began to crumble under the weight of public truth. The same social media that had spread his deceit now turned against him, fueled by Eli's raw honesty. But even as the tide turned, Eli felt no joy in victory. The past had taken too much already. On a cold night, he stood again by the fountain where it had all begun. The water rippled softly, reflecting the glow of the city that had once ignored him. He thought about how fragile redemption was, how easily the world could rebuild you one day and question your worth the next. James joined him quietly, standing beside him without a word. They both watched the water shimmer in silence. In that moment, Eli realized something profound. His art, his gallery, his name, none of it mattered as much as the act of creating itself. The world could doubt, attack, or forget, but the one thing they couldn't take from him anymore was his purpose. He was no longer painting to survive. He was painting to live. As the rain began to fall again, washing the city clean, Eli turned back toward the lighted street. The storm had passed, but another horizon was forming, not one of fear this time, but of renewal. He didn't yet know that something greater still waited ahead, a chance to give back to those who had once stood where he had been. Months passed since the storm of accusation had shaken Eli Turner's world. The city's noise had quieted around his name, the gossip had burned out, leaving behind only truth. His art remained raw, emotional, unshakable. People still came to see it, but now, they came with understanding instead of curiosity. Yet success never sat easily on his shoulders. Fame felt like a fragile coat, something borrowed, not owned. He wore it gently, mindful of how easily it could be torn away again. Eli had begun to spend more time outside the gallery, walking the same streets that once held him captive in their indifference. He noticed faces he'd never seen before, the men sleeping under bridges, the women sketching on cardboard near the subway entrances, the young dreamers lost between rejection and hunger. He saw himself in them. And with that recognition came purpose. One morning, while watching a young boy draw chalk patterns on the pavement, Eli had an idea that would soon become his greatest creation. Not a painting, but a place. A space where forgotten artists could be seen, where the invisible could become visible. He called it the Gallery of Shadows. With James Whitmore's quiet support, he rented an old warehouse near the river, a structure long abandoned, its brick walls covered in graffiti and stories of time. Most people saw decay. Eli saw a blank canvas waiting to be reborn. He began restoring it piece by piece. Every brushstroke, every nail, every sweep of dust became part of the vision. He didn't hire builders or designers. Instead, he invited the people the city overlooked, the ones with dirt under their nails and paint in their hearts. Homeless artists, struggling creators, people with nowhere else to belong. They came in small numbers at first, then more. Word spread through alleys and shelters, across benches and soup kitchens. The man who once painted by the fountain was giving others a chance to be seen. They came with their broken canvases and trembling hope, and together they built something the world couldn't ignore. The Gallery of Shadows opened quietly on a cloudy Sunday. No red carpet, no media banners, just a flicker of light in the dusk and the sound of paintbrushes whispering against canvas. The walls were lined with works from dozens of unknown artists, paintings that told stories of survival, addiction, loneliness, and hope. Each piece breathed truth. Each artist stood beside it like a heartbeat rediscovered. Eli didn't hang any of his own paintings. He said the gallery wasn't about him anymore. It was about what had been lost, and what could still be found. Visitors began to come, slowly at first, then in waves. The authenticity of it all drew them in. There were no polished surfaces, no artificial smiles, no pretension. Just art, pure, untamed, unfiltered. The city that once ignored its outcasts now lined up to see them. James visited quietly that evening, his usual calm presence standing in the corner, watching it all unfold. He didn't speak much, but his eyes told everything: pride, respect, and something deeper, almost paternal. He had given Eli the first key, but Eli had built the door himself. As the night grew late, a storm gathered outside, not one of destruction but of memory. Rain began to tap against the windows, rhythmic and gentle. Eli stood by the entrance, watching droplets trail down the glass, remembering the nights when rain had been his only companion. Now, it was applause. He looked back into the gallery. The laughter, the shared stories, the unguarded joy, it was like watching color return to a faded painting. Yet beneath the beauty, he felt a quiet ache. Every creation carried the shadow of what came before. Every artist in that room was walking a line between hope and despair, and he knew how fragile that balance could be. Then came an unexpected visitor. Victor Hale, the man whose deceit had nearly destroyed him, walked into the gallery. His eyes were different now. No arrogance, no smirk. Just weariness. The fall of his reputation had been public and brutal. His company had collapsed under the weight of his lies. He was no longer a man of power, just another shadow among many. When their eyes met, the air seemed to hold its breath. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. Victor looked around, seeing the walls painted with stories of redemption, and something inside him broke. He muttered something low, barely audible, then turned to leave. But Eli called out, not with words, but with silence. He stepped forward, handed him a brush, and pointed to a blank wall. Victor froze, uncertain. Then slowly he took it. No forgiveness was spoken. None was needed. The gesture was enough. That night, as others painted freely, Victor added his first stroke to the wall, a hesitant line, trembling but honest. For the first time, he wasn't destroying, he was creating. And in that moment, Eli understood the final truth of his journey. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, but transforming it into something new. Days turned into weeks. The Gallery of Shadows grew in reputation, not for its fame, but for its humanity. Each month, new artists came, bringing their pain, their laughter, their truth. Eli guided them quietly, never claiming credit. He became the heart of something larger than himself, a movement that gave light to the forgotten corners of the city. James continued to fund it silently, refusing public recognition. He too had found meaning again, not in empire, but in empathy. And when the sun dipped below the skyline each evening, Eli would stand by the door, watching the glow of the city reflecting in puddles. The same streets that once turned away from him now led people toward hope. Yet one more chapter of his story remained unwritten, a final act that would bind his legacy forever. For in the shadows of that gallery, among the forgotten and the found, a young artist had begun painting a portrait, one that would soon bring Eli's life full circle in a way no one could have predicted. Winter came softly that year. The city was wrapped in a pale hush, the kind of quiet that settles after both triumph and loss. The streets glimmered with frost, and the river near the Gallery of Shadows moved slowly, like memory itself. Inside, the warmth of paint and humanity still lived. The gallery had become a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where creation replaced despair. Every wall told a different story now. Some were messy, some breathtakingly beautiful, but all of them were real. Eli Turner moved through the space like a quiet guardian. His hair had grayed a little, and his eyes had softened, carrying both light and fatigue. He spoke less, painted less. He no longer needed to prove himself. His story had already been told through every hand he'd helped lift from the ground. But something inside him felt unfinished. Not in the way of ambition, but in the way of longing, like a note of music left unresolved. One afternoon, as the light spilled through the windows in muted gold, he noticed a young woman painting alone near the far wall. She had been coming to the gallery for weeks, always silent, always focused. Her work was unlike the others. It carried emotion so vivid it almost hurt to look at. Eli often paused behind her, not to correct or guide, but simply to witness. There was something familiar in her style, a rawness that mirrored his own early work. One evening, when the last of the visitors had left, she approached him, holding a canvas turned backward. She told him quietly that she had something for him, a painting she had been working on since the day she arrived. Her hands trembled as she placed it before him, face down. Then she stepped back, waiting in silence. Eli hesitated before turning it over. When he did, the world seemed to still. It was him. Not as he was now, but as he had been, sitting by the fountain in the park, his face weary, eyes distant, surrounded by the city's cold indifference. Every detail was captured. The torn coat, the half-finished sketch on cardboard, the light of a soul not yet seen. It was his past self, painted through the eyes of compassion. He looked at her, bewildered. She smiled faintly, tears brightening her eyes, and said she had seen him years ago, before his name meant anything, before the gallery, before fame. She had been a child then, watching him from a bus window every morning on her way to school. "I never forgot your face," she said softly. "You looked like someone who saw the world differently. You made me want to paint." Her name was Mara. Eli stood silent, heart tight with emotion. All the years, the struggle, the betrayal, the redemption, seemed to fold into that single moment. Everything had come full circle. The man who once painted others to survive was now being painted as a memory of hope. He asked her to hang the portrait in the gallery. She refused gently at first, saying it didn't belong with the others. But Eli insisted. "This," he said quietly, "is the truest story of all." They hung it near the entrance, where every visitor would see it upon entering. Above it, in modest script, Eli wrote, "Every shadow deserves light." The portrait became a silent heartbeat of the gallery. People often stopped before it, sensing the ache and beauty in it without knowing the full story. To them it was a symbol of resilience, of unseen strength, of what it means to begin again. Time moved on. The seasons turned, and the gallery flourished beyond what Eli had ever imagined. Journalists came and went, philanthropists offered funding, and even the city council recognized it as a landmark of cultural rebirth. But Eli, now older and quieter, began to withdraw. He painted less, spent long hours sitting by the portrait, sketching small things in his notebook, birds, rivers, faces of strangers who would never know his name. He had done what he set out to do. He had turned his pain into light for others. One cold morning, Long after the first snow, James Whitmore arrived at the gallery early. He found Eli sitting on the bench beneath his own portrait, eyes closed, sketchbook open on his lap. A faint smile rested on his face. He was gone. Peacefully, as though he had simply fallen asleep within the warmth of his own legacy. James didn't call anyone at first. He sat beside his old friend, silent tears tracing lines down his weathered cheeks. For a long time, he simply looked at the portrait, the one of the homeless artist by the fountain, and whispered, "You finally came home." The city mourned quietly. There were tributes, exhibitions, articles, but none of it captured what he had truly given, not art, but dignity. A year later, the Gallery of Shadows held its largest exhibition yet. At its center hung the last portrait, surrounded by the works of all those Eli had once lifted from obscurity. Above the doorway, carved into wood, were his final words. "Art is not what we create. It's what we awaken." And every visitor who entered felt it, the presence of a man who had painted not to be remembered, but to make others visible. As the lights dimmed and the night deepened outside, Mara stood before his portrait one last time. She touched the frame gently, as though saying goodbye to a friend she never truly met, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing us." Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and endless, the city's final applause for the man who once painted hope from the shadows.